The other day, I did a video on Richard Elliott Friedman with the Exodus, related to a video Inspiring Philosophy had done. This is the book, The Exodus, Richard Elliott Friedman, great book, highly recommend it. I was able to dig and find a couple of clips because I had a couple of people that were, hey, I know you're saying that Richard Elliott Friedman says this, but how do we know he says it? The problem is he does have a YouTube channel. It's got a series of lectures that were uploaded 2 years ago. He doesn't really do YouTube. But I was able to find a video of him talking about the Exodus. So I'm going to give you a couple of clips, and this is going to answer the questions. First off, it helps you get an overview of how it works. Now, this is a really old video. It was recorded before he did the book, but it's the basic framework of the book that he's laying out in this video. So the first clip here is going to kind of show you how it works. And let's go ahead and watch that, and then we'll get to the second one.
This fits with the possible scenario that a number of us, including me, are testing, that not all of the Israelites are part of the Egypt experience, only the Levites. This is consistent with the evidence of the Song of Deborah, which in San Diego, the land of David Noel Friedman, Zichrono Livracha, is not doubted to be one of the two oldest things in the Bible, though I learned otherwise today. In the 12th or 11th century BCE, this song lists the names of the tribes of Israel and does not include Levi. Why? Either one, because the Levites were not there yet, they were in Egypt or on the road, or two, they were not a tribe of Israel, they were a priestly group. One might respond that choice two, that they were not a tribe but rather priests, is enough. That still doesn't connect them with Egypt or an Exodus. But there's also the fact that some of the Levites have Egyptian names, like Hophni, two men named Pinchas, and of course Moses. And their description of their priestly tabernacle contains parallels with the battle tent of Pharaoh Ramses II, as was shown in a dissertation that our former student Michael Homan wrote here at UCSD under both Professor Levy and Professor Propp. Also, it is the three sources that come from the Levites, E, P, and D, that tell the story of the plagues and Exodus from Egypt. In both my identification of the sources and Professor Propp's, at which we arrived independently, though we're friends, these accounts in Exodus are from E and P. J, meanwhile, jumps from Moses saying, "Let my people go," to the event at the Red Sea. Who knows what story, if any, came between? J rather spends far more space on the era of the patriarchs, that is, the pre-Egypt period, while E spends far more on the era of Moses, and P spends so much on that Mosaic era and so little on the pre-Egypt patriarchal era that Frank Cross drew the conclusion that P was not a narrative source. I never agreed with my teacher, Professor Cross, on that point, but I understand why, again, opening the Bible first to Genesis, even a superior scholar would see a sparse narrative from P and conclude that this was not a full narrative source. But everything changes in P when that source gets to Egypt, where there is plenty of narrative. It is the Levites who had the Egypt connections, reflected in their names, their architecture, and the history and holidays that they taught their people. They taught them to practice circumcision, as was practiced in Egypt, which is required only in the Levite priestly covenant with Abraham in Genesis 17 and in the Levite priestly law in Leviticus 12. They use the metaphor of circumcision of the heart, which is found in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy, and the Levite prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and they use the metaphor of Moses' uncircumcised lips, and Jeremiah adds the metaphor of uncircumcised ears. All 11 of these references appear only in these Levite sources. The non-Levite source, J, meanwhile knows nothing about circumcision except to say that Zipporah once did something to somebody for some reason at a Malone on the way to Egypt. And so for those who argue that if there had been an Exodus, then there should be more signs of Egyptian material culture in early Israel, that argument too has substance only if we're still stuck back at the 2 million number and all of Israel participating in the Exodus. If it was just the Levites, the Egyptian cultural influences are present.
So that's a fraction of the evidence that he brings to bear in the book, and the basic process of how it works. And you notice he's got the Israelites in Canaan, while the Levites are still down there. And he gives two possibilities. Maybe they're down there, maybe they've already gotten there, and he gets into that in more detail in this next clip, what he thinks is going on with the Song of Deborah and the Levites.
So is it to be El or Yahweh? Israel had options. They could have chosen to worship both. They could have chosen one or the other. They could have said that El is Yahweh's father or his son, but they chose none of these. They said El is Yahweh. He was always Yahweh, but the Israelites in the land had not known his name because he didn't reveal his name until there were these Levites who came from Egypt to Israel. He revealed it to his greatest prophet, their leader Moses. The Levite sources E and P mentioned this story as a crucial development in their history, but the author of the J source, who was living in the same period, the 10th to 8th century, long after the acceptance of Yahweh as the proper name of God, and who was not a Levite priest, couldn't care less about when it started, and so just told the story without including that transition. That, too, may be why the Song of Deborah includes the name of Yahweh and twice identifies him as God of Israel, even though the Song of Deborah does not mention the Levites. Either the Levites were still in Egypt, and our text of the song is an adaptation of a song that originally didn't name Yahweh, just as Jay telescoped the name back in prose accounts, or perhaps the Levites had arrived and had taken up their priestly rather than tribal military muster identity. Or perhaps it is precisely the Levites who are the singers of the song to Deborah. The prose narrator attributes it to Deborah and Barak themselves, but that has always been recognized to conflict with the fact that the song speaks to Deborah and Barak in second person.
So hopefully that clears things up for people. That's where he's coming from. Now, I wanted to add something here because he doesn't get to this in the book. I'm sure it's something he knows about. It was something I didn't know about. Here's another great book for you, Genesis and the Moses Story, Conrad Schmidt, yeah. So Conrad Schmidt, if you think about the story that he's laying out here, okay, you got the Israelites up in Canaan, and you've got the Levites, unrelated group, down in Egypt. They're going to leave in the Exodus, and they're going to get together up in Canaan, right? So that would mean we have two different histories, okay? We would have the history of the peoples that are up in Israel. We would have their histories, and then we would have the history of the people that came up from Egypt. And so I just found it interesting. It brought to mind this from Genesis and the Moses story. And I'll try to put a graphic of this on the screen if I can. But this is Conrad Schmidt pointing out the similarities between, it would be in Exodus 1 and Judges 2, where the Pharaoh has forgotten the Israelites, and the Israelites have forgotten God, right? So in Exodus 1, and this is verses, looks like 6 and 8. And Joseph died and all his brothers in that entire generation, and there arose a new king over Egypt who knew nothing of Joseph, okay? Now, if you jump over to Judges 2, 8, and 10, and Joshua son of Nun died, and also that entire generation was gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them who knew nothing of Yahweh. So you see the similarities there. This is like probably the redactor, okay, that is bridging a gap here. This starts a history. And so the first one would be in the beginning of Exodus, starting the history for the Levites, the Moses people. And the second one is in the beginning of Judges, starting the history for the Israel people. And of course, in the middle, between Deuteronomy and Judges, you have the completely mythical story of the conquest that you get in Joshua. So it's just interesting to me. He doesn't lay that out in a book, but it's interesting to me that the redactor separates these as to, I'm assuming it's a redactor. I could be wrong. I didn't look it up. That the redactor puts these two histories together and starts them off in the exact same way. That generation died, a Pharaoh rose up who knew not Joseph, and then when we get to Judges, that generation died and a generation grew up who knew not Yahweh, right? Starts each of the two different histories the same way. I just found that interesting myself. Genesis and the Moses story, this is a harder one, okay? I'm not a scholar. This is a little harder to follow, a little more in-depth. This is very much for the average person like myself, The Exodus by Richard Elliott Friedman. Love the book. Highly recommend it. You guys have a great day.